The window is located in the school's junior library and is therefore not normally accessible by the general public. However, it wasn't always here and is, in fact, much older than the current building.
Hello, I'm Rob Rymel and I attended Cheltenham Grammar School for Boys, as it was then called, from 1963 to 1970. After my first year and a half in the old High Street building, we moved in 1965 to the building in Hester's Way. The stained glass window was then brand new. It had been facilitated by a bequest from a Mr. Richings, a former school bursar. The room in which it was originally located was named the Richings Library in his honour. The 1965 building was pretty much masterminded by the then head teacher, Dr. Arthur Bell. It was he who devised a brief of sorts and set a budget for the window. My guest today will speak more of this in a few moments. The new building was designed by architects Chamberlain, Powell and Bon, who designed London's Barbican and other famous modernist landmarks, including several educational institutions. They were selected as a result of Dr. Bell's extensive research into modern school buildings and their architects.
The Richings Library was given special treatment by the architects. This image from the school archive shows the dramatic dark grey ceiling and matching lampshades and the fine furniture. This grainy picture is from the Gloucestershire Echo, which ran a number of illustrated articles about the new school shortly after it opened. The stained glass can be seen in the distance. Regarding special treatment, note the architect's general detail for the library rooms. High-level clear-story windows which provided good natural light but facilitated bookshelving on the walls below. It can be seen that in the Richings Library, the architects considerably enlarged the opening for the stained glass window so that it occupied more than half of the external wall.
I'm delighted to welcome to the school local author, stained glass expert and current chair of Friends of the Wilson, Adrian Barlow. Adrian was delighted and impressed when he first saw the window a few months ago. Welcome, Adrian. Can you tell us a little more about your reaction to the window upon seeing it for the first time?
When I first saw it, I must admit I was bowled over. As a small boy, I went in 1962 to visit the then newly consecrated Coventry Cathedral, and the stained glass made an impression that's never left me. Now, this window was made only a couple of years after that. It was installed in 1965, and I don't know of any other abstract stained glass in this country of that date which has such power, such energy, such colour, such dynamism. I think it's a remarkable, possibly unique piece of art for its time.
Thank you, Adrian, for those few words of introduction.
I'd like to say something about the origins of this remarkable window. Back in 1961, the then headmaster of Cheltenham Grammar School, Dr. Arthur Bell, was busy. He was actually in the throes of designing and bringing about the creation of a brand new, very modern building, the new school designed to go on Hester's Way. He was a remarkable man in every sense, a man of great energy, of foresight, determination. He was a scientist. I think he'd like to have been called a rationalist. I should say I've never met him, but I've got to feel I know him really quite well. And one day just before Christmas in 1961, he sat down to write a letter to the architect, Mr. Bonn of the partnership Chamberlain Powell Bonn, because he'd had a new idea. He wanted, at the heart of his new school, to place a room which didn't actually seem to have much relevance to the school. It wasn't to be a library, it wasn't to be a teaching room, it was simply to be a room where, particularly at the end of school, boys could come, because in those days it was a boys-only school, boys could come to sit, to read, to think about their day's work, to dream ideas for the future. He was very clear that it was not to be a school chapel. He didn't want a school chapel. He said in his letter, "The room is not to be used as a chapel, it'll be used for speech and reading. Yet we cannot assume the possibility we cannot deny the possibility that at some point there will be written work at times." It wasn't to be a library, it wasn't to be a place where boys would come and do their prep. It was where they could relax, read, talk, be themselves. And he said, "I should like a stained glass window in the west wall." And he was very clear that it needed to be the west wall because that was where the late afternoon sun would shine through this glass. "I think this should be," he says, "an abstract window. Yet, if I were asked to suggest a subject," he says, "I would have no difficulty. I should like the artist to suggest what Christian in Pilgrim's Progress saw when he was asked, 'Who do you see yonder shining light?' And he replied, 'I do. I do see the shining light.'" It's as if, by virtue of his training as a scientist, as a rationalist, he still had this sense that young people particularly could suddenly see something beyond themselves. And that's what he wanted this room, and in particular this window, to encourage. He says, "My own feelings about the window are not quite so simply expressed. He wrote, I want this room to encourage reflection. A religious and Christian boy should get a lot from such surroundings, yet I'm even more concerned that the great mass of other boys will not feel ill at ease, but will enter this room with real pleasure. And the youthful skeptic may still have his ear cocked for that power, not ourselves, that makes for righteousness." That quotation, interestingly, is from Matthew Arnold. And Matthew Arnold was the great apostle, if you like, of religious doubt in the Victorian era. Unfortunately, there's no reply in the school archives to that letter sent by Dr. Bell just before Christmas in 1961. We have, in fact, to wait till February 1963 when we get another letter from Dr. Bell to the architects in which he says, "My last point is the stained glass window, which I feel should run across the south wall, the full width, to give something quite striking in the library." You can sense from this that Bell had in his mind exactly what he wanted the library to contain, how he wanted it to look. If, he says, we could get Mr. John Piper to do the window for us, that would be magnificent. The stained glass in Coventry Cathedral is, in my opinion, the best thing about it. We have, in fact, the sum of some £300 to £400 available. Well, I think he was a bit optimistic if he imagined he could get John Piper to produce a window for the new grammar school for a sum of under £400. Nevertheless, with the encouragement of Mr. Dent, who was the principal of Cheltenham College of Art, he decided to contact directly the Royal College of Art in London. And he went there because the artists who had worked with Basil Spence on the stained glass of Coventry Cathedral were from the Royal College of Art. In particular, Lawrence Lee, who was head at that stage of the stained glass department at the college, worked with two young colleagues of his, Keith New and Geoffrey Clark, and it was this team that Dr. Bell now approached. And having approached them, he was delighted to receive a letter from Lawrence Lee, whose reputation was made by the work he did at Coventry. And Lawrence Lee said, "I'm afraid the big problem is going to be cost. But do not worry," he says, "because we can show you some new techniques in stained glass which I think would be less expensive and which might well appeal to you, because they will be able to produce a window which will be light, airy and innovative." Dr. Bell, to his great credit, was a great enthusiast for innovation, and that's what he got. One of the thoughts that Mr. Dent, the principal of Cheltenham College of Art, had was that if you approached the Royal College of Art, this might be the kind of project that they could get their students to work on, and that, of course, would reduce the cost. Not any longer a window by John Piper, but a window under the auspices of Lawrence Lee and his work people in the college. And that's exactly what happened. Geoffrey Clark, who was also a sculptor and indeed was responsible for the great cross on the high altar of Coventry Cathedral, was the person whom Lawrence Lee designated to look after this project. And he took to it with a will. And he had a young student called Mr. Guy. I'm afraid we don't at this moment know for certain his first name. The suggestion is that it might have been Tyrone Guy, but we haven't been able to trace such a person. But we do know that Mr. Guy was the person who drew the designs for the window. We know too that Dr. Bell was delighted with them, and we know that the windows were created and installed in the by then brand new library of the new school in February of 1965, and the opening of the building followed shortly after that. And we have a last letter in the archives from Dr. Bell direct to Mr. Guy, saying that he would be delighted if the young man would like to come to the college, to the school, to meet the governors and to see his window in situ. Clearly, for Mr. Bell, for Dr. Bell, this was a major project which was coming to a triumphant conclusion. For many people, the stained glass is the finest element in Coventry Cathedral. And this was the work, first of all, of John Piper, who, working with Patrick Raintians, produced the great baptistry window, which is the first thing most people see when they enter the building. But the windows on either side, that's to say, liturgically speaking, the north and south, though actually the building is not orientated like that, it's the east and the west, these 5 windows on each side are the work of Lawrence Lee and his 2 colleagues, Geoffrey Clark and Keith New. Basil Spence, the architect of the cathedral, had the idea that on one side the windows should reflect the idea of man, and on the other side they should reflect the idea of God. That's a very generalist sort of definition of what he wanted, but it shows that he did not want these windows to represent the sort of familiar biblical scenes that one associates with stained glass, whether it's from the 12th, 13th and 14th centuries, or indeed from the 19th. Certainly, Spence was anxious to get right away from the kind of pious Anglican Victorianism that most people associated with stained glass, as indeed did Dr. Bell, the headmaster of the school. And it was this sense of liberation from that which I think appealed particularly to him. If you look at this picture that I'm showing you now, which is of the south side, that's liturgically speaking the south side of the cathedral, you'll see that each of them is built on a grid system. The grid is the same in each window. The height of these windows, by the way, is terrific. It's over 75 feet each one. But within that very pronounced grid, there is a great variation, dynamism, variety, both in colour, in shapes, in forms, and indeed in biblical imagery, because there are some crosses, there are some icons and some symbols which you would recognise. These are the windows that were done by Lawrence Lee himself, and they are the sort of things which I think Dr. Bell would have responded to very well indeed. And it's always important when thinking about this window here in the junior library at Pate's, as it now is, to bear in mind their genesis is really these windows in Coventry Cathedral. So we come now to look at this extraordinary window in some detail. And first of all, I'd like you to imagine any stained glass window in any church or cathedral that you care to bring to mind. Now contrast what you're looking at with or what you're imagining with the window that I'm showing you, which is the window in Pate's Junior Library. By contrast, almost certainly with any window that you have imagined, this one is horizontal rather than vertical. It's also important to say that it is surrounded as a frame almost by black, and this is black glass, and black glass is almost never ever seen in medieval or indeed in Victorian glass. For one reason, it's actually very difficult to produce without it going very smudgy. But the black glass in this window, with some exceptions, as I shall point out in a moment, is absolutely dense, so you get a sense of a frame. Now let's look at the whole construction of it. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 panels, but you'll notice that the panels, although they look at first glance symmetrical, are actually not. The second one from the left is slightly narrower than the second one from the right. It's important too to say that although we tend always to look at windows left to right, you can also look at this window from right to left, and indeed that's one of the challenges of it. I'm going to start, however, right in the middle and invite you to let your eyes scan from left to right and from right to left again. In the centre there is a rather confused mass of colour, tiny fragments of glass, and very little sense of which direction anything is moving. But if you look out to the left first of all and go to the far end, you can see in the left-hand segment what could almost be the beak, the head of a bird, possibly even a bird with an eye. And if you look at the far right-hand side, you can see possibly the heads of fish or snakes. And then slightly further in from the right-hand side, you've got a great swirl, a scroll like a snail shell or a nautilus, possibly even an ammonite, because there is something very ancient about the forms in this window. Something almost as if you're looking through the window of an aquarium or down into the depths of the sea. And certainly a lot of the images that you can see here do appear to be aqueous, fishy, monsters, strange creatures, some of them swimming around, some of them lurking. It's, on the one hand, almost sinister, but on the other hand, the colour, the range of colour, makes it anything but sinister. You'll notice that there are actually two great swirls. There's the one on the right, which is a fully formed snail shell or nautilus. On the left, towards the left-hand end, you've got a more open swirl. It's a thinner one, but the two together seem to be linked by the lines of orange and purple that join them at the top. And it's almost as if they are like wheels in motion, as if this is a great train hurtling forwards, or a great animal. If you like to look again at the face on the left-hand side, perhaps it's no longer a bird's face to you, it's the face of some marauding animal, either a very slow turtle or a very stealthy jaguar. The reason I'm giving you these suggestions is because this is a window which invites you to read into it what you might see, and the things you see might differ from one moment to the next. It's even possible, if you take those two scrolls together, the one on the left and the one on the right, and to see them linked as they are at the top, then to close your eyes and think of the great Ionic capitals on the columns of the colonnade at Pittville Pump Room. There is something of an echo of that. So this is a window which looks backwards in time in imagery, forwards in time, which has a sense of dynamic movement, a sense of stasis. It's a marvellous kaleidoscope of colour, of fragments, of ideas, of images. That's why I think it appealed to Dr. Bell. I want to say something now about the technique used to create this window. I'm going to look first of all at the third panel from the left, which is, at first glimpse, if you take it out of context, almost a jumble that it's hard to make sense of. But in some respects, of course, it is still looking like traditional stained glass, particularly because the different pieces of glass are held together by black lines. And this is where the fundamental difference between this window and medieval or Victorian glass, or indeed mainstream 20th century glass, even some of the windows in Coventry Cathedral itself, this is where the difference can be most clearly seen. In traditional stained glass, the black lines are actually lines of lead which in cross piece is like the letter H, capital letter H, and these are called cames, and the different pieces of glass are slotted into the top bit and the bottom bit and then sealed in place, and it's the lead that literally holds the glass together. If you look at this window, you'll see at first glimpse that yes, there are lots of black lines. But interestingly, these lines are remarkably thin by contrast with the sort of lines that you would see if you go into your local church or into a cathedral and have a chance to look with some care at the glass. In those windows, the glass may be anything, the lines may be anything up to half a centimetre or a centimetre wide. Not so here. And the reason is that these are not lead lines at all. So how on earth, you might ask, does the window stay in place? You'll remember that one of the reasons why Dr. Bell was attracted to the Royal College of Art was because in his first letter, Mr. Lee, Lawrence Lee, said, we have various new techniques which might enable you to be able to have a window that fits your rather limited budget. The technique that they were pioneering at this time is called applique, which is a word that will be familiar to any of you who are interested in quilting and in embroidery and so on. But here, unlike a traditional piece of stained glass, the coloured glass is laid onto, and in fact glued onto, float glass, plain glass or window glass if you like. So this is very definitely at least a two-layer window. The plain glass, the absolutely clear glass on which the coloured fragments, the design, is actually literally stuck with glue. And the kind of glue that is used is a special sort of bonding glue which begins white and opaque, but as it dries to a transparent colour, but a colour that can sometimes still be seen. And this gives the glass rather the effect of bubbles in very old glass. So it's an interesting texture that the glass acquires. And the black lines, well, rather surprisingly, this is essentially the same material as used for grouting, but it doesn't have sand in it, and it has added to it polymers that give it almost a kind of elastic context, an elastic texture, if you like, and an elastic function, because it helps the glass to respond to temperature change, which makes glass expand or contract. The polymer in the grouting helps that expansion to take place. Briefly now to look at some of the details in the third panel of the window from the right. It's the panel which has half of the spiral, the snail shell in it. What I want to draw your attention to are a couple of technical things. If you look at the darker blue passages in the circle, you can see some curious marks behind. I say curious because it's not immediately apparent what they are. But if I tell you that is where the adhesive has been applied to the back of the piece of glass, upwards and downwards, as it were, by the artist, literally as he squeezes the adhesive out of the tube, then you can understand what this pattern is. And you can see it in some of these other purple passages, purple blue pieces as well. That's experimental, but it also helps to give a sense of contour and context, as well as a sense of texture to the individual pieces of glass. And if you look at the passage that goes across the top area of the shell, that starts with green and then purple and a wide stretch of very pale green and so on, going right the way across, you can see similar pieces of evidence behind the glass. So that the glass isn't just flat, it isn't just plain. All the time there's a sense of shadow, texture, definition, even of disruption within it. One of the things you frequently find in old glass is that bits have broken in the past, either through weather or carelessness or whatever, and have had to be repaired. And that repair usually involved, or almost always involved, using a new piece of lead. And there are one or two places in this window where almost cheekily, it seems to me, the artist has reminded us of that. And I'm looking now quickly at the pink piece, 1, 2, 3 pieces in from the end of that section that goes right away across the shell. You see, as it were, two little fragments of almost sort of semicircular pieces have been, as it were, chipped out and look as if they've been replaced. Further down in the blue, again, there's a large sort of segment that seems to have broken away, and that has got a line in it that appears to be a breakage. It could be a real breakage. Now, I'm not saying it's not, but there is evidence here that even though this is not lead, it is grout with polymer, the same effects can be created, probably for the very same reasons. It's interesting, in fact, to compare that blue piece with some of the tiny pieces of orange or grey or purple glass elsewhere. Very small pieces of glass, each of which, as in medieval glass, has to be separately linked into all the other pieces by the use of lead originally, but here by the use of the grouting. And if you look on the left-hand side, or the left-hand half of this piece of glass, over and over again, you find differences in the thickness of the grouting. So you get a very thin pencil line across some of the pieces of the orange, and then suddenly, particularly where it meets the grey piece of glass, almost a kind of splodge of grouting. So you get a sense of texture, of thickness, and, if you like, evidence of the handmade character of this. There's nothing machine-made about this window. This is all put together by hand, and that's a really important feature of it. I want finally and briefly to take you away from Pate School, across country to King's Lynn in Norfolk, to show you a window by Geoffrey Clark, the person who I'm sure was responsible for overseeing the creation of this window, and to compare this window of Clark's in King's Lynn with the window in Pate's, because I think there's some very important comparisons to be made. This is in the Minster Church of King's Lynn, St Margaret's. It's a modern window, comparatively speaking. Its date is 1967. That, of course, is the date of installation. So it's almost certain that this window will have been made either immediately after the Pate's window, or indeed could well have been underway at the same time. And really just two or three features I want to draw your attention to. Although this is clearly a window in a 16th century perpendicular window with all the tracery at the top, it is also on a grid. The upright lines in perpendicular tracery go from the base right the way across to the top of the arch, and there's a transom, that's the horizontal line, about 3/4 or 2/3 of the way down. So like those Coventry windows, this window is itself divided by a grid pattern. And then on the glass, actually not just the stonework, but on the glass you can see there is a crisscross of thin black lines creating a whole series of small rectangles which become a very important part of the film, not of the film, but of the glass. And running up the glass itself is a long figure rather like a snake. And where have we seen the possibility of a snake before but in the Pate's window? Where too have we just recently seen the blue and the orange side by side offset against the grey. And if you look at the grey swirl at the very bottom left-hand corner, you can see there the clear use of the grout and polymer. Tiny little details, almost like a kind of spider's web. By comparison, on the right-hand side of the window, there is much more formal use, sometimes even of leadwork itself. It's a remarkable window, but it belongs very much with the window at Pate's because they are both experiments using the same kind of frame of reference and several of the same techniques. In comparing the window at Pate's with this window in St Margaret's, the Minster at King's Lynn, I simply want to make the point that the window in the grammar school is by no means unique. It belongs within a context, and that context is the work being done by teachers and students at the Royal College of Art in London at a particular key moment, the 60s, the 1960s, where the impetus to stained glass in this country given by the work at Coventry Cathedral owed everything to Lawrence Lee, Keith New, and particularly Geoffrey Clarke, whose influence can be seen so strongly at Pate's in the window in the junior library. I said at the beginning I thought it was a magnificent and almost unique window, and I stand by every word I've said. I think Pate's and Cheltenham are very lucky to have such a remarkable work of art. Thank you for watching. Our research into this extraordinary window is ongoing, and if you have any information or material about it that you think would be of interest or of help in our research, do please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.